worth $100 million, yet she's scraping gum off a billionaire's shoe. For 3 months, she endured the cruelty of a man who treated her like furniture until he invited her to a gala as a joke. He had no idea he just invited the woman who holds the power to bankrupt his entire legacy. Hae-in scrubbed the cold floor of the Kwon Corporation's headquarters on her hands and knees, her reflection distorted in the gleaming stone. 26 years old, billionaire heiress, playing janitor. "You missed a spot," Kwon Tae-jin said, stepping over her without breaking stride. The Mafia boss was on his phone laughing. "Actually, you know what? I'm throwing a gala tomorrow, you should come." Hae-in looked up. Tae-jin's smile was poison wrapped in silk. "Wear something nice. It'll be hilarious watching you try to blend in with actual people." His associates erupted in laughter from the doorway. Designer suits, expensive watches, cruel entertainment. Hae-in returned to scrubbing, saying nothing. But in her head, she was already choosing which attire to wear. The emerald silk handbag she'd commissioned. Perfect. Let's see who's laughing when she walks in holding more money than Tae-jin's entire net worth. The heavy scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey hung thick in Kwon Tae-jin's private office, a room designed to make everyone who entered feel small. Hae-in moved silently near the corner, her movements practiced and invisible as she pushed a mop across the polished mahogany floor. She kept her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the soapy water, but her ears were tuned to every word spoken at the massive desk. Tae-jin sat there, a titan in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanding the very air. Opposite him sat 2 associates from a rival faction, their faces tight with a mix of fear and greed. They were finalizing a territory agreement, a deal that would cement Tae-jin's transition into the legitimate corporate world Hae-in actually ruled. "The terms are non-negotiable," Tae-jin said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the room. "You sign, or we stop talking, and you know what happens when I stop talking." The associates scrambled for their pens, but the tension in the room had reached a fever pitch. One of them, a nervous man with sweat beading on his forehead, reached for the contract but fumbled. The heavy gold pen rolled off the desk, clattering onto the floor and sliding toward Hae-in's bucket. Tae-jin's eyes followed the pen, then shifted to Hae-in. He didn't see a woman, he saw a tool. "You," he barked, snapping his fingers. "Come here." Hae-in paused, her heart skipping a beat against her ribs. She didn't look up, maintaining the facade of a terrified laborer. She shuffled forward, kneeling to retrieve the pen. As she reached for it, Tae-jin leaned back, a cruel, bored expression crossing his sharp features. "I don't have time for you to find a flat surface," he muttered to the nervous associate. He looked down at Hae-in, who was still on her knees. "Stay there, lean forward." Hae-in felt a cold shiver of fury settle in her gut, but she obeyed, bowing her head until her forehead nearly touched the wood. She felt the weight of the heavy leather-bound contract as Tae-jin dropped it onto her back. The sharp edge of his designer shoe pressed into the side of her thigh as he adjusted his position, using her spine as a literal desk. The room went silent, save for the scratching of the pen against the paper. Hae-in could feel the pressure of the signature through the thin fabric of her gray uniform. She was a $100 million philanthropist, a woman who had negotiated deals with heads of state, and here she was, being used as a human footstool by a man whose empire she was currently deciding whether to save or destroy. Tae-jin chuckled, a dark, mocking sound as he felt her steady her breathing. "Useful for something at least," he remarked to his guests, who joined in with hesitant, sycophantic laughter. "Normally, I'd have my furniture imported from Italy. Today, the janitor will do." He finished the signature with a flourish, the pen digging into the muscle of her shoulder. He didn't thank her. He didn't even acknowledge her as she remained frozen, waiting for the weight to be lifted. When he finally pulled the contract away, he gave her a dismissive kick to the hip with the toe of his shoe. "Get back to work, and clean that spot you missed near the door. It's disgusting." Hae-in stood slowly, her face a mask of subservient calm. As she turned back to her mop, she caught her reflection in the glass of a bookcase. Her eyes weren't the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a predator who had seen enough. The character test was over, and Kwon Tae-jin had just signed his own social death warrant. Hae-in retreated to the dim, sterile light of the supply closet, the heavy door clicking shut to muffle the sounds of Tae-jin's laughter. She didn't collapse or cry. Instead, she stood perfectly still, letting the phantom pressure of the contract on her back settle into a cold, hard resolve. Reaching into the pocket of her oversized, scratchy uniform, she pulled out an encrypted burner phone. A single notification blinked, a summary of Bennett Global's closing stock price. Even while she was being used as furniture, her net worth had climbed another $8 million. This was the character test, a self-imposed trial that her board of directors called insanity and her mentors called a god complex. To the world, Hae-in was a ghost, a reclusive billionaire who controlled the flow of international tech markets from a glass tower. But Hae-in knew that figures on a balance sheet were lies. The true value of a man wasn't found in the polished version of himself he presented in a boardroom. It was found in how he treated those who could do absolutely nothing for him. She thought back to the initial pitch from the Kwon Corporation. Tae-jin had arrived at her headquarters in a fleet of black SUVs, projecting the image of a reformed visionary ready to take his family's blood-soaked legacy into the light of legitimate hospitality. He was charming, articulate, and desperate for her $500 million endorsement. On paper, the deal was perfect. In person, his eyes had been too hungry, his smile too rehearsed. "If I am to tie my name to his," she had told her head of security, "I need to know if the man is a partner or a predator." So the world's most powerful heiress had vanished. She swapped her silk blouses for polyester and her penthouse for a cramped staff dormitory. For 3 months, she had become invisible. She had scrubbed the toilets of men who would have crawled through glass just to shake her hand in her true life. She had watched Tae-jin when he thought no one was looking, noticing the way he never thanked the kitchen staff, the way he looked through the janitors as if they were made of glass, and finally, the way he had used her spine as a desk without a second thought. Her thumb hovered over the abort button on her screen. She could end this now. One phone call would pull the funding, collapse the merger, and leave Tae-jin's empire to be devoured by his creditors. But that was too quick. He hadn't just failed the financial due diligence, he had failed the test of human decency. Isabella's joke, invitation to the gala was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the perfect stage for a social execution. Hae-in tucked the phone away and picked up her mop, her movements once again fluid and humble. She would play the part of the trash for one more night. She would let them laugh, let them step over her, and let them believe they were the masters of the universe. Because when the music started at the Founders' Gala, Hae-in wouldn't be arriving to clean the floors. She would be arriving to collect the debt of every insult she had silently recorded. The janitor's name tag was a disguise, but the $100 million donation check was a weapon, and she was finally ready to draw it. The following morning, the headquarters was a hive of frantic activity as the staff prepared for the gala, but Hae-in moved with a different purpose. She knew the layout of the executive floor better than the security teams who patrolled it. While Tae-jin was preoccupied with a final rehearsal for his grand speech, Hae-in slipped into his private office under the guise of polishing the heavy floor-to-ceiling windows. The air in the room felt different today, heavier, charged with the desperate energy of a man whose empire was built on sand. Tae-jin's transition to legitimacy was the narrative he sold the press, but Hae-in knew that a tiger rarely changes its stripes. She moved toward the massive mahogany desk, the very one where she had been forced to kneel just 24 hours earlier. With a practiced, invisible motion, she retrieved a small, high-frequency signal interceptor from her cleaning cart and placed it beneath the desk's edge. The device hummed to life, bypassing the office's biometric encryption within seconds. Hae-in's tablet, hidden inside a stack of microfiber cloths, began to bleed data. What she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't just the aggressive tax evasion or the standard Mafia-style laundering. Deep within the encrypted Project Phoenix, files lay evidence of a systemic betrayal. Tae-jin wasn't planning on going legitimate. He was planning to use Hae-in's $500 million investment to fund a massive, high-tech smuggling operation through the very hotels they were supposed to build together. He wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for a shielded bank account. Even more disturbing was a folder labeled due diligence targets. Hae-in felt a chill as she saw her own name at the top of the list. Tae-jin had private investigators tracking her real identity for months. He hadn't found the connection to the janitor yet, but he was hunting the ghost CEO with a predatory hunger. He knew she was reclusive, and he planned to use that mystery against her, manipulating the merger to eventually stage a hostile takeover that would strip her of her own company. A heavy footfall echoed in the hallway. Hae-in didn't panic. Her heart rate remained steady, a product of years of high-stakes negotiations and the cold realization that she was no longer just testing a man's character. She was dismantling a threat. She snatched the interceptor back just as the door handles turned. By the time Tae-jin walked in, flanked by 2 armed guards, Hae-in was on her knees near the window, her back turned, scrubbing a spot of imaginary grime with rhythmic, subservient strokes. "Get out," Tae-jin snapped, not even looking at her. He threw a thick folder onto the desk, the same desk he had used her spine to sign upon. "The cleaner is always underfoot. Make sure she's gone before the board arrives." Hae-in gathered her supplies, keeping her head low. As she passed him, she caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished glass. He looked triumphant, a king on the verge of a great victory. He had no idea that the invisible woman walking past him had just seen every skeleton in his closet. The test was officially over. Tae-jin hadn't just failed, he had declared war. And as Hae-in stepped into the elevator, she knew exactly which weapon she would use to end it. The $100 million check was no longer just a donation. It was the bait for a trap that would snap shut at the gala. The preparations for the Founders' Gala reached a fever pitch as evening fell, transforming the corporate lobby into a cathedral of glass and gold. Tae-jin stood at the center of the chaos, checking his reflection in a blackened window, the image of a man about to ascend to the throne of legitimate society. But even as he prepared to greet the city's elite, his appetite for cruelty hadn't been satiated. Hae-in was in the back hallway, moving a heavy floor polisher, when Tae-jin's voice cut through the hum of the machine. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by a group of investors he was desperate to impress, men who valued power above all else. "You there," Tae-jin called out, his eyes glinting with a sharp, predatory playfulness. He gestured for Hae-in to approach. "I've been thinking about the opening ceremony, the stage in the grand ballroom. It's not quite right. There's a smudge on the north platform, right where the spotlight hits." Hae-in stood still, her hands resting on the handle of her equipment. "I'll take care of it immediately, sir." "No," Tae-jin said, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. "Not now. I want you to do it during my opening remarks. In fact, I want all the custodial staff on the floor. It'll be a poignant reminder to our guests of where we started, and the trash we have to move out of the way to build something great." One of the investors chuckled, a dry, sycophantic sound. "A bit theatrical, isn't it, Kwon?" "It's a lesson in perspective," Tae-jin replied, his gaze locking onto Hae-in's calm, unblinking eyes. "I want you on your hands and knees, scrubbing that stage while I explain the future of this company. I want them to see the contrast between the visionary and the help. It'll make the anonymous donation reveal even more spectacular." Hae-in felt the weight of the insult, but she didn't flinch. She saw the trap he was setting, a public humiliation designed to break the spirit of the people who kept his world running. He wanted to use her one last time, not just as a footstool, but as a prop for his ego. "As you wish, Mr. Kwon," she said softly, bowing her head. Tae-jin laughed, slapping one of his associates on the shoulder. "See, they're like dogs, they appreciate the direction." He turned back to her, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "Make sure you wear your most pathetic uniform. I want the contrast to be stark. If you miss a spot tonight, you won't just be fired. I'll make sure you never find work in this city again." As he strode away, his laughter echoing against the marble, Hae-in finally looked up. Her expression remained controlled, but a spark of cold fire danced in her gentle eyes. He had just handed her the perfect moment. He wanted her on that stage, under the brightest lights, in front of every influential person in the country. He wanted a show of power, but he had no idea that the prop he had just ordered into the spotlight was actually the director of the entire play. She reached for her burner phone and sent a 3-word message to her team waiting in the service garage. "Emerald is go." Tae-jin wanted a spectacle. Hae-in was going to give him one that would burn his empire to the ground before the first glass of champagne was even finished. The service elevator in the basement of the Kwon Corporation hummed with a low, mechanical vibration that felt like a heartbeat. While the elite of Seoul arrived at the front entrance in a parade of limousines, a nondescript black van pulled into the loading dock. 3 men in sharp, tactical suits stepped out, carrying a garment bag that was handled with more reverence than a religious relic. Hae-in stood in the center of the cramped locker room, the scent of bleach still clinging to her skin. She had already peeled away the stiff, gray polyester of her janitor's uniform, leaving it in a heap on the floor, a discarded skin she would never wear again. When the door opened, her lead security strategist, Min-jun, stepped inside. He didn't see a maid. He bowed deeply to his CEO. "Everything is prepared, ma'am," he whispered, his voice crisp and professional. "The funds have been moved into the escrow account for the reveal. The board is seated. Tae-jin is on stage." He unzipped the bag, and the room seemed to brighten. The emerald silk handbag was a masterpiece of hidden power. It wasn't just clothing. It was a $2 million statement of heritage and dominance. The silk had been hand-woven in a secluded mountain village, dyed with crushed jewels to achieve a green so deep it looked like the heart of a forest. The embroidery along the hem was done in genuine silver thread, depicting a phoenix rising, a subtle irony given Tae-jin's Project Phoenix secrets. Hae-in stepped into the garment, the heavy, cool fabric flowing over her frame like liquid emerald. As her stylist secured the crisp white collar and pulled her dark hair into a clean, low bun, Hae-in's entire presence shifted. The submissive curve of her shoulders straightened into a line of absolute authority. Her face, once a mask of weary labor, now carried a refined, unshaken elegance. She looked 10 steps ahead of everyone because she was. She looked at her hands. The cracked skin from the cleaning chemicals was gone, replaced by the glow of expensive oils. She refused the heavy diamonds Min-jun offered, choosing instead to wear nothing but the silk. She didn't need to sparkle to be seen. The sheer quality of the fabric and the steel in her gaze told a story of wealth that didn't need to shout. Finally, Min-jun handed her a slim, leather-bound folder. Inside sat the $100 million check. Her name, Hae-in Sterling, was written in a sharp, bold script that looked like a jagged blade. "The boss expects a janitor to crawl onto his stage," Min-jun remarked, checking his watch. "He's currently telling the crowd how he raised the standards of this building." Hae-in took a final breath, her expression controlled and knowing. The trash was gone. In her place stood the woman who was about to prove that a tiger doesn't change its stripes, but a dragon can hide in the tall grass until it's time to breathe fire. "Let him have his moment," Hae-in said, her voice a calm, dangerous melody. "The higher he stands on that stage, the further he has to fall." She turned toward the service stairs that led directly to the wings of the grand ballroom. Every step she took was silent, the emerald silk rustling like the wind before a storm. The transformation was complete. It was time for the world to see the face behind the signature. The heavy velvet curtains of the grand ballroom offered a final barrier between the quiet dignity of the wings and the cacophony of the elite. On stage, Kwon Tae-jin stood bathed in the warm glow of gold spotlights, his voice booming with a rehearsed confidence as he spoke of rising from the shadows and cleaning the path for a new era. He was at the peak of his performance, the crowd hanging on every word of his manufactured transformation. "And to ensure we never forget the grit required to build such an empire," Tae-jin said, his voice dropping into a mocking, theatrical lilt, "I've invited the very people who keep our foundations spotless to join us, a reminder of the dirt we leave behind." He gestured toward the side of the stage, expecting a line of weary, uniform-clad staff to shuffle out with buckets and mops. He wanted a tableau of humiliation to amplify his own grandeur. Instead, the music died. The orchestral swell of the violin quartet faltered and then went silent, replaced by a sudden, heavy vacuum of sound. The doors to the wing didn't swing open for a group. They opened for one woman. Hae-in stepped into the spotlight. The rustle of her emerald silk handbag was the only sound in the cavernous room, a soft, expensive whisper that felt louder than a shout. The fabric caught the light, shimmering with the deep, dark luster of a forest floor, its silver embroidery flashing like lightning. She didn't shuffle. She didn't bow. She moved with a calm, refined elegance that felt ancient and absolute. Her dark hair, pulled into that severe, perfect bun, emphasized the graceful line of a neck that had never truly belonged under a janitor's collar. The air in the ballroom seemed to exit the lungs of every guest simultaneously. Gasps rippled through the rows of tuxedos and gowns. This wasn't the help. This was power personified. Tae-jin's speech died in his throat. He turned toward her, the smirk of a conqueror still half-formed on his lips, but as his eyes traveled from the hem of the $2 million gown to Hae-in's steady, observant gaze, his entire world tilted. The sharp, masculine lines of his face froze. His eyes widened, the pupils shrinking in a moment of visceral shock. His mouth drifted open, the polished executive facade cracking to reveal a man who suddenly realized he was the one being hunted. He looked at her face, the same face he had used as a footstool, the same face he had dismissed as trash. And for the first time in his life, Kwon Tae-jin looked small. Hae-in stopped at the center of the stage, just inches from him. The contrast was a physical strike, his rigid, panicked tension against her unshaken stillness. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly into his soul with a small, knowing smile that told him the game was over. She wasn't holding a mop. She was holding a leather folder with the grip of someone who owned the air he was breathing. The silence stretched, agonizing and public, until the only thing left in the room was the sound of Tae-jin's shattered confidence hitting the floor. Hae-in stood in the center of the storm, the eye of the hurricane, waiting for the exact moment to let the lightning strike. Hae-in did not wait for Tae-jin to find his voice. She knew that in the world of power, silence was a vacuum that only the strongest could fill. While the Mafia boss stood paralyzed, his executive mask shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, Hae-in slowly opened the leather folder. The movement was deliberate, drawing every eye in the ballroom to the slip of paper held between her slender, steady fingers. She didn't tremble. She didn't rush. She stood with the poise of a woman who had already won. "You spoke of a new era, Mr. Kwon," Hae-in said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a crystalline clarity that cut through the stagnant air of the room, reaching every corner of the silent gallery. "You spoke of cleaning the path, but you forgot that the most important part of any foundation is the integrity of the person standing on it." Tae-jin's throat worked visibly, a dry, clicking sound as he tried to swallow. He looked at the check, his eyes darting to the zeros that seemed to stretch on forever. The massive $100 million figure was printed in a stark, unapologetic font, but it was the signature at the bottom that acted as the final blow. Hae-in turned the check toward the audience, the spotlight catching the ink. At that moment, the gala's master of ceremonies, sensing the shift in gravity, stepped forward with a trembling hand to the microphone. His voice echoed with a mix of awe and terror. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer stammered, his eyes glued to the document, "the anonymous benefactor, the primary donor for tonight's foundation, is none other than Ms. Hae-in Sterling, chairperson of Sterling Global." The name hit the room like a physical shockwave. Sterling, the ghost CEO, the woman who moved markets with a whisper and whose face had remained a mystery to even the highest circles of Seoul's elite. The gasps from the guests turned into a low, frantic roar of whispers. The investors who had laughed at the janitor just hours ago now looked as if they wanted to sink into the floorboards. Tae-jin felt the blood drain from his face until he was the color of ash. He looked from the check to Hae-in. Eyes, the observant, intelligent eyes of the woman who had watched him fail every test he didn't know he was taking. He remembered using her back as a desk. He remembered the kick to her hip. He remembered calling her trash. "You," he managed to choke out, his voice a pathetic shadow of its former command. "It was you." "I came here to see if you were a man worth my investment, Tae-jin," Hae-in said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous silkiness meant only for him. She stepped closer, her emerald handbag rustling like a warning. "I worked your floors. I endured your insults. I watched you treat human beings like furniture. You wanted a $100 million donation to buy your way into my world." She let the check hover between them for a heartbeat, before laying it flat on the very podium where he had just delivered his lies. "The money is real," she continued, her small, confident smile finally reaching her eyes. "But the woman you treated like trash is the only one who can sign it. And after what I've seen, your name will never be on the same page as mine." The signature of power wasn't just on the paper. It was written in the absolute control she held over the room. As she stood there, radiant in emerald, the $100 million check became a tombstone for Tae-jin's ambitions. He had been waiting for a savior, never realizing he had been stepping on her the entire time. The silence following the announcement was more than an absence of noise. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing shut around Tae-jin's throat. He stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the check, then on Hae-in's steady, unblinking gaze. The reality of his situation didn't just dawn on him, it crushed him. In his world of violence and shadows, he was a king, but in the world of global finance and ironclad legacies, he was a ghost. And Hae-in Sterling was the one who decided which ghosts were allowed to haunt the daylight. A low, collective murmur rippled through the ballroom as the city's most influential power brokers realized they had witnessed a social execution. The investors who had stood beside Tae-jin just an hour ago, laughing at his janitor jokes, now took collective steps back, physically distancing themselves from a man who had become radioactive in a single heartbeat. Tae-jin's hands began to tremble, a minute tremor that he couldn't suppress. He looked at the emerald silk of Hae-in's gown, a garment that cost more than the yearly salaries of his entire security detail, and remembered the sharp edge of his shoe pressing into her thigh. He remembered the dismissive kick he'd given her after using her as a table. Every insult, every cold command, every moment he had treated her like a piece of refuse now felt like a nail being driven into his own coffin. "Hae-in, Ms. Sterling," he stammered, his voice cracking, the deep baritone of the Mafia boss replaced by the thin, reedy pitch of a desperate man. "There has been a misunderstanding, a role play of sorts. I was testing the resilience of my staff. You weren't testing resilience, Tae-jin. You were indulging in the only thing you truly understand. Cruelty," Hae-in interrupted, her voice a calm, surgical strike. She didn't raise her voice, yet it carried over the whispers of the elite. "You thought you were the predator because you held the whip. You never realized that the person at your feet was the one who owned the floor." The weight of the Project Phoenix files she had uncovered sat between them like a hidden blade. Tae-jin saw the knowing glint in her eyes and realized with a sickening jolt that she didn't just know his character, she knew his secrets. She knew about the smuggling, the laundering, and the betrayal he had planned for her. If she walked away from this deal, his creditors would descend like wolves. If she handed those files to the authorities, his life was over. He was no longer the broad-shouldered titan of the Kwon Corporation. Under the harsh, unforgiving gala lights, he looked small, his tailored suit suddenly appearing too large for a man who had lost his stature. He reached out a hand, a reflexive gesture of supplication, but stopped before he touched the emerald silk, realizing he was no longer worthy to even be in its shadow. The power hadn't just shifted, it had evaporated from his grasp. Tae-jin looked around the room, seeing the cold, judgmental faces of his peers, and then back at the woman he had treated like trash. He had spent his life demanding respect through fear, only to be dismantled by the quiet, refined elegance of a woman who didn't need to say a word to destroy him. He wasn't just losing a merger. He was losing his life's work, and the realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest, leaving him breathless in the center of his own crumbling empire. Hae-in did not look at the fallen man with pity, nor did she look at him with rage. She looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a diamond grater dismissing a flawed stone. The room was deathly silent, the air thick with the realization that the hierarchy of the city had been rewritten in a single breath. "The $100 million is on the table, Tae-jin," Hae-in said, her voice a calm ripple through the stillness. "But as of 5 minutes ago, my legal team filed the acquisition paperwork for the Kwon Corporation's debt. You didn't just fail a character test, you failed a business one. You sold your soul to creditors to fund a criminal enterprise I've already dismantled." Tae-jin's knees hit the stage with a heavy, hollow thud. The sound echoed through the ballroom, the definitive crack of a collapsing empire. He didn't fall by force. He fell because the ground he thought he owned had been pulled out from under him. He looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and pleading, his hands clutching the edge of the podium for a support that was no longer there. The Mafia boss was gone. There was only a man drowning in the wake of a woman he had mistaken for a ghost. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "I can change. I can make it right." "Dignity isn't something you make right once the lights are on," Hae-in replied, her emerald silk rustling as she took a single step forward, standing over him. "It's how you act when you think no one is watching. You treated the woman who could save you like trash because you believed she was beneath your notice. Now, you'll learn what it feels like to be truly invisible." She turned her gaze from the man at her feet to the rows of elite guests, her presence expanding to fill the entire ballroom. "From this moment forward, the Kwon Corporation is under the management of Sterling Global. The board is dismissed. The criminal ventures are terminated. This building will no longer be a fortress of fear, but a house of service, starting with a complete overhaul of how we treat our staff." She reached down, picked up the $100 million check, and handed it to the head of the janitorial union, who stood stunned at the edge of the stage. "For the pension fund," she said softly, a genuine smile finally breaking her composed mask. Hae-in began her walk off the stage, her posture perfect, her head held high. She didn't look back at Tae-jin, who remained on his knees in the spotlight, a prop in his own final act. As she reached the exit, her security team fell into step behind her, a wall of black silk and iron resolve. The doors swung open, and the cool night air of Seoul rushed in to meet her. The city sparkled below, oblivious to the revolution that had just occurred in a single ballroom. Hae-in stepped into her waiting vehicle, the emerald silk of her hanbok glowing one last time before the door closed. She had spent months scrubbing floors to find a man of character, and while she hadn't found one in Tae-jin, she had found something better, the absolute certainty of her own power. The new order had begun, and for the first time in 3 months, Hae-in breathed in the scent of victory, and it smelled nothing like bleach.